I think that when uh, the, the IQS School of Management planned this talk, was trying to uh, work in something that can be related with the two schools, and I think that you are a magnificent example of how this economic part should be strongly related with the engineering part. So I think that you are going to enjoy this explanation, a discussion about the effect of the economic policies in the results and the importance of technology just giving their good advice for that. So thank you very much for coming here, and please, Dr. Comín, just introduce our speaker.
Oh, good morning. Now, I have to start by saying that it's an honor to have Professor Pollitt here with us, but I wanted to say also something on a personal note, because when I think about academic excellence at Cambridge, I think that the name of Professor Pollitt immediately comes to mind, and you might think, wow, why is that? Might be because of his prolific research output. Perhaps he's discussing issues which are really the key issues of our times. Might be because of that, and then I took note of, which is quite a list of the topics like energy economics, and we know his work a lot about energy economics and electricity regulation, but also on productive efficiency measurement, not least about business ethics and business best practices, about public policy, about economic growth, and about quality of life as well. But you could also say that it's because his amazing productivity as a researcher. I was just checking the number of papers he did last year, and it was around 15 papers, just not a bad year. And we look at silly things like H index, and it's amazing 41, but then if you go to Google Scholar, you're going to see numbers which are unbelievable. So he's remarkably productive. But I think what really stands out is not simply about the themes, not simply about how amazingly prolific he is in terms of research outputs, but I would like to call your attention to his genuinely kind personality, his unassuming personality mixed with his scholarly work, which is really elements of distinction. Now, I should mention to you that he holds the position of Professor of Business Economics at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, where he also serves as Assistant Director of the Energy Policy Research Group. He has acted before as the Executive Director of the ESRC Energy Policy Research Group, has contributed with his expertise as a member of the New Zealand Commerce Commission's expert panel on input methodologies. He has served as an external economic advisor to Ofgem and an energy advisor to the UK's Consumer Association. When it comes to his academic work, he contributes to the board of several leading journals. I'm just going to mention a few so for you to have an idea, like the Energy Journal, the Review of Industrial Organization, Competition Regulation, Network Industries, Energy and Climate Change, Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy, Utilities Policy, and I'm going to stop here. He was also Vice President for Publications of the International Association for Energy Economics. He's also academic director at the Center on Regulation in Europe, which is a research affiliate at MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, a fellow of the Payne Institute for Public Policy, and throughout his career he has advised numerous organizations. Again, the list is long. I'm just going to mention some to you, so for you to have an idea, like the UK Competition Commission, the New Zealand Commerce Commission, Ofgem that I mentioned before, Ofwat, ESRC, the Norwegian Research Council, DTI, the World Bank, the European Commission, among others. And when it comes to his consulting portfolio, we have here just someone like National Grid, Nuon, Roche, Tenet, among others. Now, before joining the Judge Business School, he was also a lecturer at the Faculty of Economics in Cambridge. He was a board member of trustee of the Viva Network in Oxford. He was a visiting associate professor in the Department of Economics of MIT, where he co-led the Cambridge MIT electricity project. And there's more, because he also has a very interesting work on faith and climate change. So he's part of business ethics. He has this work that we were talking about yesterday about Christian economics, which also links to many things we do here in terms of our identity and mission. But I understand you're here to listen to him, so I just wanted to say that we are extremely grateful. We are very honored for his kindness and generosity of being with us here today. He's a very distinguished professor in all these fields I have mentioned to you, and it's such an honor and privilege to have Professor Pollitt with us today. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, some of that was true. So thank you very much, Flavio. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should say Flavio and I go back a very long way to our work together teaching undergraduates at Cambridge University, 30 years ago. And we've been around so long that one of my school friends is now the master of St Edmund's College, where Flavio was, and continues to have his association with Cambridge. So it's wonderful to be here, and thank you all for coming. And I hope I'm going to say something positive. We live in a world where there's not a lot of good news at the moment, but I'm going to talk about some of the good news when it comes to policy, and also when it comes to the influence that academia can have on policy. I think climate change is an extremely exciting area for academic researchers, and it is one where the entire area is driven by academic research. Both the solutions to climate change, the analysis of climate change itself, and also the policy implications of climate changes, which is what I'm going to talk about now. And I'm pleased to say that you're all in the right place. Of course, I've come from somewhere where we made a disastrous, very stupid decision to leave the European Union, which was, of course, an act of economic insanity, but which, please don't leave the European Union, okay? But one of the joys of preparing this talk has been to, actually think, right, here I am, I'm going to get to talk to a European audience about something that Europe is actually doing well in, contrary to what a lot of people think. So let me start with what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that, in my view, we do know the answer to climate change policy. One of the things that I enjoy doing as an economist is completely denying the sort of classic joke about economists that you put two economists in the room, you get three opinions. Actually on many issues, economists basically agree what should happen. And it's important to actually be clear what those issues are and what the evidence says. So I'm going to talk about one of those issues where I think the evidence is pretty clear what we need to do. Of course, just being clear what we need to do is not the same as getting it done. So I think we have got the answer to climate change. The question is how to get it implemented. And that's where you all come in, because it'll probably get implemented long after Flavio and I are enjoying our well-earned retirement. Okay, so let me talk a bit about the Brussels effect. The Brussels effect is this idea that we are in if you like, a European moment in world history, where Europe, in terms of the regulations and standards that it sets regulations and standards for the world. At least that part of the world that wants to be the best. So we don't want to be Arkansas. We want to be California. Okay, we want to be the state within the US that actually sets the high standards, not the ones that set the low standards. Similarly, within the world, the European Union should be a standard setting body for the world where it's setting high standards. And that happens in a number of areas, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's happening in competition policy, the sort of trying to rein in the power of large oligopolistic firms that dominate many industries. It happens in digital services, and trying to regulate all of the new technologies that are coming out of the digital information space, particularly the use of social media and things like that. And it happens in any area to do with health and safety, where many countries continue to have way below optimal levels of health and safety regulation. And it happens in the area of the environment, which is what I'm going to talk about, where the EU is demonstrating policies that actually could work at the global level. One of the things I like to wind up American academics about is most American academics need to get out more, because actually they're obsessed with what happens in Congress, and what happens in Congress is really not that interesting from a global point of view. What happens in the European Union is much more interesting than what happens in Congress, because what happens in the European Union is 27 sovereign countries agree on policies and agree on coordination of objectives, and that's much more interesting than 20 states within 50 states within the US. So let's talk about what global climate policy actually should be about, and why the European Union might be very significant in demonstrating how to get an effective global policy. First of all, we know, I've been involved in modeling exercises of how to get to net zero and completely decarbonize the economy. They all come up with similar results, and the similar results are: we need to get demand down for energy relative to business as usual. We need to electrify everything that we can, because electricity is easy to decarbonize relative to other energy vectors. We need to decarbonize heating, where we're using gas for heating. We need to electrify it as much as possible, possibly use hydrogen, possibly use synthetic fuel, possibly use methane, biomethane, sort of green methane. And for transport, again, increasingly we can electrify most types of surface transport. Only the heaviest duty trucking maybe won't be electrified, but even that, as batteries improve, it's not altogether clear. And maybe we need some hydrogen, synthetic fuel, ammonia produced synthetically, to decarbonize heavy duty shipping, air transport. These things everybody's working on. We know that they can be, in theory, be done. Of course, what it's going to imply is higher carbon and energy prices. So the price of CO2 emissions from polluters is going to have to go up. So people are going to have to face the cost of putting gases into the atmosphere that warm it up. There'll probably be more international trade in electricity. Again, the European Union is demonstrating how that can happen with the single electricity market in Europe, allowing the joint optimization of matching electricity supply and demand across an extremely wide area, allowing the optimal exploitation of wind and solar resources. And we will need some negative emissions. So we'll continue to use some fossil fuels for some things, and we will produce some CO2 when we burn them, and we'll have to have some way of netting that off, either with carbon capture and storage or with direct air capture. Okay, so we know what to do. I mean, that's, we can argue about what the modeling shows different mixes of those technologies that I've just mentioned, depending on their relative cost. But in terms of, are the technologies available to do decarbonization? Absolutely yes. Of course, how is decarbonization actually going? Really badly. At best, all that global policy towards decarbonization has done is stabilized emissions at the global level, at best. So yeah, they're probably lower than they would have been, but they're not absolutely lower. So, it's going really badly in terms of actual policy. Why is it going badly? It's going badly because most supposed policies about decarbonisation are not actually about decarbonisation. I love this study. This study is 1,500 policies that are supposedly about decarbonisation across the OECD, and only 63 of them actually worked. In actually a significant, a statistically significant reduction in CO2 as a result of the policy. Which policies were they? Mainly carbon pricing and renewable support schemes, or mixes of the two of those types of policies. All other policies don't work, or they're not about decarbonisation. So, policies to subsidise things like energy efficiency don't really work in general. Okay. So we need to be a bit, clear that lots of things get labelled as decarbonisation policies, but they aren't actually decarbonisation policies. Okay, what about? I want to a big shout out for one of my colleagues at Cambridge, Kamiyar Mahadis, who's done some work, which is part of this work with both BCG and other colleagues associated with Cambridge University. Where one of the things we've been learning over the last few years, again with better economic modelling, is that climate change is going to be even more costly than we thought to the global economy. These latest estimates are sort of 15 to 34% reduction in GDP by 2100. So that means the economy will be up to a third smaller than it would otherwise have been every year beyond 2100 if we don't do something about climate change. These are much bigger than the initial estimates of how damaging this is going to be, partly because we're now beginning to understand that in a very heavily integrated economy, anything which disturbs normal activity, a bad storm rolling in, actually is very economically damaging, even in an advanced economy which is not dependent on agriculture. People thought that climate change damage was originally going to be about agricultural production mainly, and advanced economies would not suffer big GDP reductions, but actually advanced economies are so integrated that weather does play a big impact factor on whether production can continue at the optimal level. We need to do something about climate change is the bottom line, or else it's going to be even more damaging than we initially thought it was going to be. Okay, so we need some policies that do work, and of course I've hinted at some of them that do work. Of course, it's important to say that there are other ones out there that could work. Here's one I particularly like. Those of you who work on 3D printing will recognize this. This is a replicator from Star Trek, the TV program about the 23rd century. And those of you who are familiar with replicator technology will know that it can produce anything with absolutely no cost and no resources. It can also dematerialize anything at no cost. So it's the perfect circular economy technology. And of course, we dream of technologies like this. And 3D printing, of course, was meant to be a technology like this, where you could basically produce anything with a machine, with one machine, with a bit of programming and very little resources. Of course, if we could come up with a carbon-free source of energy which also didn't use any critical minerals, didn't use copper, it wasn't blindingly expensive, we could live in the world of the 23rd century in Star Trek, where there is no money, by the way, and economists are all out of work. because there's no scarcity. So I don't know what economists are doing in the 23rd century. There are books on the economics of Star Trek. Anyway, the other one, of course, is something else that's from Star Trek, which is world government. I should show you what the world government looks like. So world government, of course, one of the reasons why climate change is a particular problem is it's a global externality problem. Of course, if you had world government, it wouldn't be an externality. So the world, the benign world government that was interested in the social welfare of its people, would solve the climate change problem by just taxing and subsidizing CO2 and solutions to CO2. No problem. Unfortunately for us, even in Star Trek, world government doesn't start till 2154, so we'll all be dead by the time we get round to world government. Of course, in the meantime, I've got the economics solution. And of course, many economists have suggested that this can work, which is, a system of carbon markets which gradually manage the quantity of CO2 and greenhouse gases being put into the atmosphere down towards a net zero consistent level, and all CO2 and CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases are part of this system somehow. And of course, doesn't have to be a single carbon market, it could be a set of interconnected carbon markets. And carbon markets, are the potential solution to climate change. Of course, I would put up this graph. There's a lot of debate about carbon markets. One of the debates about carbon markets is, aren't carbon taxes better? Of course, as a good economist, you should know that the equivalent, that you could either control the quantity of emissions, or you could control the price. And in theory, if you get the price, the carbon tax right, that would be equivalent to controlling the quantity. The problem with that argument, which is originally an argument due to Marty Weitzman, whose picture is here, is that, of course, what scientists increasingly tell us is we need to get to a safe level of emissions reduction. So unless we're out at this optimal, we've reduced emissions enough from zero reduction in emissions, to avoid these cliff edge climate effects where the climate heats up so much that the ice caps melt and cities fall into the sea, we run the danger that the carbon tax is not high enough. So of course the beauty of carbon markets is that we can set the quantity at the minimum safe level of emissions reduction in a way that we might get the tax too low. That seems more likely than getting the quantity right. Okay. This again, I love to talk. American economists, what they tend to do, they've got, when people talk about carbon markets versus carbon taxes, they often say, there are I can put up 4 things and it's 2-2 in terms of the score. Carbon taxes get 2 out of 4 and carbon markets get 2 out of 4. So it's a dead heat. Okay, the problem is they haven't got not a long enough list of all the things that are good about carbon markets, which are bad about carbon taxes. Of course, some of them you could pick out there. One of the most obvious ones is that cross-border coordination of carbon markets, which the EU ETS clearly demonstrates, is much easier than coordinating carbon taxes across borders. There are virtually no example. I could of course stand to be corrected. Virtually no examples of cross-border coordination of tax rates at exactly the same level. There's some light coordination of tax rates across the EU, but they tend to be coordination of tax bands, not of tax rates. So the idea that we're going to have a global carbon tax, which some people are still, dreaming about, that's never going to happen. Whereas a set of interconnected carbon markets, which cover most countries in the world, that's already happening. We're already seeing that happen. Okay, so clearly carbon markets win hands down on that. The other interesting thing about, we're just thinking about this in the run-up to giving the talk, actually with climate change, we do want to fit and forget policy. What we'd love to do is get the overall policy environment for climate change right, so have, the maximum quantities of CO2 equivalent emissions being set out to 2050 or 2070, bringing it down to the net zero level. We fit in that policy, and then we go away and just do our things, innovating low carbon technologies, responding to the incentives that would inevitably set up, and we wouldn't have to keep coming back revisiting what the tax rate was in every country every year. I mean, the idea that somehow this is even possible, that you could have some tax-based coordination is a joke. Whereas having carbon market-based coordination, where maybe we only revisit the quantities in the carbon market every 10 years, which is what happens in the EU, that seems very possible. One of my students and I did some analysis of the 73 carbon pricing schemes that there are in the world, which both have carbon taxes or carbon markets, and basically they do perform as you would theoretically expect, both in theory and in practice. And actually one of the interesting things is the prices do tend to go up over time. And so we are seeing this tendency, which theory would suggest is necessary for carbon prices to rise over time. They have fallen over certain time periods. Okay, it is all happening, albeit very slowly. So explicit carbon emissions pricing is spreading, and it is spreading globally. So it's in this, it's what, 22%-ish, that's right, 22-23% of all emissions are explicitly part of a carbon tax or a carbon market, with carbon markets covering about 2/3 of that. Chinese have just announced an extension of their carbon market, which will cover an additional 6% of global emissions. So it's about to go up towards 30% of all emissions. So, the idea of pricing all emissions, sending a signal throughout the economy to economize on carbon production, that is happening, and it's happening globally. And the fact that it isn't happening as much in the United States is interesting, but hopefully irrelevant. Of course, the quantity is one thing, the price is another thing. So the price is only increasing from a very low amount. So this is the average price of all carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per ton in the world, including the 78% that isn't priced. So that's priced at zero. So the average price of all emissions has got up to a heady $5 a ton. Okay, climate models say $100 plus is what the right level is. If you were trying to send a serious net zero consistent signal, the price now would need to be $100 about, or that order. So 5 is definitely too low. Of course, it's actually 25 on the stuff that's priced, but it is too low. So what's needs to happen is happening, but very slowly. So can we have a global carbon market? I hope so. It doesn't need to be one single carbon market. It can be a set of interconnected carbon markets. It doesn't even have to have the same price in every carbon market at the same time. Actually, that's not optimal. One of my colleagues at Cambridge, Robert Ritz, has written about this, and how it's not actually optimal necessarily to have a single carbon price across the whole world when countries are at different levels of development. Lesser developed countries, their optimal carbon price is lower, given that a lot of other prices are lower. But for rich countries, it is higher than 5 or 25. And of course, you can imagine a system where you know, the formal carbon market doesn't perhaps extend to all sectors, because there is a sort of a combination of carbon taxes and carbon markets within individual countries. But as long as overall they're hitting the quantity cap for total emissions consistent with climate science, that would be okay. Okay, so that's what, you know, the solution to climate change policy exists. Okay, what about the helping part? So the title of my talk was about how the EU can help or hinder global decarbonisation. Here's how it's helping, and it's helping big time. You know, the European emissions trading system is a tremendous success. You know, it's like the world's longest running, most successful environmental pricing policy, and it does work. Of course, if I'd given this talk a few years ago, people said, oh, well, it doesn't work because the price is really low. But actually, the price has now risen. It's about 70 euros a tonne at the moment. And it's expected to rise further than that. So, you know, it's a pretty decent carbon price. I'll talk about how it's being extended. The quantities of permits have been gradually reduced. You know, one of the problems that it's had is that actually it's still the case that the green quantities are being given away free to polluters. That is missing out on revenue. One of the charges of people who are still in favour of a carbon tax is that, well, carbon tax collects more revenue than an emissions trading scheme. Of course, that doesn't have to be true. If you sold all of the permits as you issued them, you auctioned them off to polluters, you could in theory raise the same amount of money as a carbon tax. But it is true that the EU started giving them all away free and has only gradually reduced the free allocation, and there's still all of the permits that cover heavy industry, heavy energy intensive industry like aluminium, steel, cement. Those are still being given away free, and that is a loss of revenue, which isn't necessarily a good idea. It has, you know, one of the great things about the EU ETS, which started in 2005, it's still going. 20 years later, it's still going, and it's still innovating. Of course, the UK did leave, but not because we didn't like the EU ETS, okay? But that was for other reasons. You know, still covers about 36% of EU emissions. It is not one of the most interesting developments. Is it recently, a few years ago, coupled to the Swiss scheme? So basically the price in the Swiss national carbon market is the same as the price in the EU ETS. There's just been an announcement very recently that on the 19th of May, we're probably going to announce that we're coupling the UK and the EU schemes. Price has already risen in the UK scheme towards the EU one on the announcement of that coupling. So we're coming back at least to the emissions trading scheme. It's been extended across sectors. There is this market stability reserve. One of the reasons the prices started going up in 2018 was because there was a lot of excess permits which have been gradually removed from the scheme through this buying up in the stability reserve, which is explicitly about raising the price. And there's been these two major developments. One, the carbon border adjustment, which I'll mention in a minute, and the creation of a second scheme, EU ETS 2, which will be covering heating and transport, which will essentially double the coverage of the existing scheme. Okay, important to say that actually if you look at EU emissions allowance prices, they're expected to go up. I mean, this is a zero interest-bearing financial asset. The only reason why a rational investor would hold one of these, and there are a lot being held in permit, banks, is if you expect the price to go up. And if your futures prices are, it's actually not a bad investment. Okay, they actually the futures prices, which you can get out to 2033, incorporate a higher price, which would effectively give you a rate of return higher than German government bonds. So they've got interesting price dynamics, which are actually in line with the underlying purpose of carbon markets in trying to price the value of CO2 reduction today, given that the damage is going to be at some point in the future. So they do have good price dynamics. So what about ETS2? So this is the, I like to say, I am saying, this is one of the consequences of the UK leaving the EU. If we'd been in the EU, we'd have never agreed to this. I.e. agreeing to extend the scheme, but to create a separate scheme. I mean, who thought of that? Well, the answer is probably some German economists, because actually this scheme is very like the scheme they have in Germany, because in Germany they, in 2021, did extend carbon pricing to heating and transport fuel. So if you drive your car in Germany, or you burn gas in your home heating in Germany, you are paying a carbon tax now, which is not true in other European countries, or a lot of other European countries. Of course, what's wrong with this is why a separate scheme? It doesn't make much sense to have a separate scheme, given that we want one carbon price across the whole European economy. The energy economy is being increasingly integrated between heating, transport, and power. We should have the price of CO2 being the same in each of those energy use cases, because increasingly we're going to be using the same technologies across each of them. But for some reason this was implemented, and it was implemented with a price cap, which is actually below the current price of the EU ETS1, the initial scheme. And of course that potentially could create problems where, if we think the two schemes are going to be merged at a certain date in the future, actually what's going to happen is the price will on day one in the second scheme move to the maximum price and sit there, rather than actually integrating the two schemes from the beginning. One of the reasons why they appear to have implemented two schemes was a worry about the day one impact. The day one impact actually is potentially quite large. So, as soon as you introduce a price of 45 euros a tonne, or what it would be today, about 56 euros in current money, that does produce a big one-time effect on both heating and transport. It's particularly big in heating if you burn methane in your gas boiler for heating. And it's potentially 9% of the current price on average. Less in richer countries, which have got higher methane prices for domestic consumers, but that's still a pretty significant one-day hit, which is coming. In gasoline, it's easier because, of course, we already have very high taxes on gasoline. So in theory, we could reduce other taxes a bit to absorb some of the one-day impact. And the impact is a bit less, but it's still pretty big one-day impact. So now, and here's another major innovation that's coming along, which is this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is potentially a really helpful development. So now what's going to happen soon is that if you import these 6 commodities into the EU, you are going to face a carbon border adjustment tax, which reflects the fact that if you can produce these in the EU, you are part of the emissions trading scheme, whereas if you bring them into the EU, you could be bringing them in from a country that has no carbon pricing. So what the EU is going to do is put a carbon border adjustment mechanism in, which means that if the price is exactly the same of carbon that your steel industry faces in the country that's exporting into the EU, of course there'll be no carbon border adjustment charge. So this is why the EU, with the UK and the Swiss have coupled or want to couple directly to the EU ETS, because there will be no carbon border adjustment tax in place if they do that. If you're China, where the carbon price, there is initially no carbon price on steel within China, steel production within China, you would face an adjustment charge which is equal to the value of the EU emissions trading scheme price. So that's what your carbon border adjustment would be. So you can imagine all importers into the EU of these materials that are going to be covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism, they now have an incentive to increase their own carbon prices so that they get the money from carbon pricing rather than the EU gets it through the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So actually this is a pretty genius way of getting other countries to adopt carbon pricing. And actually that seems to be what its effect is going to be. It's coming in gradually, so what's happening is European producers of steel are gradually going to have their free allowances reduced, and then they're going to be gradually protected with these carbon border adjustment mechanism taxes as their free allowances are reduced. And the full liability to CBAM, so you won't be liable to the 100% differential between the China carbon price and the EU carbon price until 2034 if you're a Chinese steel producer. And indeed there is a sort of gradual implementation where the free allowances are reduced to current steel producers, for instance, in the EU, and the liability to CBAM gradually increases to 100% if you're a steel importer into the EU. What effect is this having? Now, this is one of the... Okay, of course it's not just about the EU. Actually, if you know, a lot of the modelling that we do at Cambridge, we try not to forget, that Europe is bigger than the EU. And as Boris Johnson used to say, we're leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe. Okay? So let's imagine there's something called E30, which is the EU 27 plus Norway plus Switzerland plus the UK. Of course, that's pretty, that is a significant addition to EU GDP and to the significance of the European economy. And as you can see, the European economy is pretty significant. The interesting thing from this, these statistics is, of course, the EU has been quite successful, or the E30 have been quite successful at decarbonisation and now are a lower share of world emissions than they are of world GDP. But the interesting thing, and this is an interesting statistic, one of the big differences between Europe and the United States is Europe invented free trade. Okay, that actually of all exports and imports, Europe is still 1/3 of all imports in the world. I think I put that down, haven't I? Now, of course, there is a bit of double counting here, because that includes trade between European countries. But but in general, it is true that for a given European country like Spain or the UK, we are much more internationalized than China or the US, and that partly explains our continuing support for free trade. But of course, it also explains why we'd be happier to implement the CBAM than a lot of other places, and that's what's going on. And CBAM, of course, is going to have an impact. Actually, these are the countries who are affected by value from CBAM. These are the exports that are exposed to a CBAM because they export the CBAM covered sectors into the EU. Of course, the UK is actually number 4 on the list by value. It's a long way down the list by share of GDP, but it is by actual value. Of course, that would give you a number of, if you see CBAM coming and you're not a European country, what could you do? Okay, well, you can either do what the Swiss and the UK are doing, which is just couple your emissions trading scheme to the EU's one, You could introduce your own sort of retaliatory CBAM. You could, of course, try and argue that actually the steel that's coming from China has been produced with zero carbon electricity, and so we've signed some contracts with the Three Gorges Dam in China, and that's called resource reshuffling. So, you know, even though Chinese electricity is reasonably dirty on average, of course there's some of it that's very clean, and you could try and shuffle that towards the export sectors and try and argue that their CBAM liability is actually very low, because that's somewhat unethical to do that, because that's not the spirit of what this is really about. But introducing your own carbon pricing scheme would seem to be a sort of sensible solution to CBAM. And indeed, I've mentioned the two major responses which seem to already be happening. China has announced an expansion of its scheme to include the CBAM covered sectors, so China's carbon market will be expanded sometime this year to cover those sectors. There's been a recent announcement about that, and the UK has produced some very detailed plans to actually introduce its own CBAM, and I think this coupling meeting, which is going to be happening in May, is part of the UK's response to CBAM. And indeed, if you look across the world, there's all sorts of interesting CBAM responses happening. Other countries have announced expansion of their carbon pricing schemes, so Turkey, Morocco are responding with expansion of carbon pricing. And other countries, even the US, are introducing their own CBAM. So this Brussels effect through CBAM is actually extremely large. And for China, of course, this is very significant potentially. There's a big gap between the current Chinese emissions price, which only covers electricity, and the EU price, so there's going to be quite a big CBAM liability there. And I've been working with Chinese colleagues on actually what China should do is now think about coordinating its gradual extension of its carbon market to more sectors, raising the price towards the EU one on this 2034 time frame, where 2034 is the year in which you have 100% liability to the difference in your carbon price and the EU one, and hence that gives us China a sort of target for converging its carbon market with the one in Europe. And of course, I think we are seeing, when I go to China, is one of the things I talk about, and we are seeing a lot of European-Chinese collaboration on carbon pricing. Okay, that's the good stuff. That's how the EU is helping. This CBAM is really having an impact, and it's having an impact because it's based on an effective carbon pricing scheme that we already had in Europe. Of course, how can the EU hinder? This is a shorter list. Of course, carbon markets continue to have big problems. I think one of the things that hasn't happened with carbon markets is we haven't thought carefully enough about the impact. So I talked about that day one impact of extending carbon pricing to heating and transport, clearly mitigating that to some extent and effectively recycling the revenue from carbon pricing towards people who are badly affected. That actually must happen. And if we put as much effort into thinking about that as we should have done, we wouldn't have delayed implementing effective carbon pricing for as long as we have. Of course, people could misinterpret the CBAM as a sort of aggressive, carbon tax equals tariff. Okay, of course, one of the things that has happened with CBAM is carefully associating it with environmental impact rather than being primarily about trade, because it's actually saying, look, if your carbon prices are the same as ours, there'll be no CBAM. So it's not a tariff, but it can look like one, and that is a problem. I should give a shout out for my colleagues at the Centre on Regulation in Europe. This is a Brussels-based think tank. We recently published a set of ambitions for Europe for the current Commission's period, 5-year term. And I'm pleased to say, number one of our ambitions was about fair and efficient energy and carbon markets, and the one that I wrote was about extending the EU ETS. And we made a number of recommendations in there, some of which I've already trailed. I think integrating EU ETS 1 and EU ETS 2 is a sort of a no-brainer. It's probably going to happen financially anyway. It's not clear why you would have a separate scheme. I don't think it's a sensible thing to do, and other carbon pricing regimes don't do that. You know, California and British Columbia have schemes which will have a similar coverage to what we'll have in Europe once ETS 2 is implemented, but they have a single scheme. I mean, why wouldn't they? They've worked out that you don't need 2 schemes. It does need to be effectively implemented. You know, calculating what the CBAM liability is going to be is quite important. And of course, being open to coupling directly with other carbon markets is important. I'm pleased to see that, you know, the UK isn't being frozen out of a coupling, you know, because we're still being punished for leaving the EU, which I recognise every time I come through passport control, where for some reason people from Switzerland can go through with people from the EU, but people from the UK can't. You know, please can you change that? So, you know, this is an opportunity for the EU to extend its carbon market to actually effectively include European periphery countries that aren't part of the EU, and that would make a lot of sense and would increase the power of the EU. Okay. There's some other things that can be done. One of the consistent charges against the EU ETS over recent years has been the failure to admit projects from developing countries into the scheme through certified emission reduction credits, which used to be possible, but isn't possible at the moment. So there's not. The EU still could do some more work promoting decarbonisation in poorer countries through admitting credits, something that's been, you know, been criticised for at COPs. I think continuing to develop the relationship with China and forming a sort of climate club between the European countries and China is really important. We still haven't solved the problem of how to admit negative emissions into the emissions trading scheme. These are going to be increasingly important. How you credit direct air capture schemes within the carbon market or carbon capture and storage schemes within the carbon market, we still haven't worked out how to do that yet. And ultimately, this is one for the economists in the room, you know, we're going to need a two-sided carbon market where when we've hit net zero, we'll actually have people who pollute will have to find, you know, have to be in a market where people who are removing emissions through direct air capture or carbon capture and storage, you'll be trading on a two-sided market, and the government won't be setting the quantities anymore. The government will just be monitoring that the total emissions and the total removals are the same, and that's all that needs to be true in the limit. Okay, so back to global climate policy. I think there are reasons to be hopeful. I think we are making progress. I think carbon markets are winning the argument. And I think an important thing to say is, of course, people may be sitting there thinking, are carbon markets the only policy to promote decarbonisation? No. But they are the policy that guarantees that we do decarbonise. Because if other policies don't work, the carbon price will go up. You know, if subsidies to renewables or support for nuclear or our R&D investments in direct air capture don't pay off, we will be falling back on higher carbon prices to ensure that the global economy is decarbonised. A nice way of representing that is this picture from California, where, you know, they start off with total emissions. They get to the target by the end of the period that's being discussed here, and some part of, you can work out what, each policy might contribute to the reduction. And even at the end of that, there's a gap. And the gap is what carbon pricing alone will do. So yes, we can subsidize renewables, we can subsidize efficiency, we can invest in high-speed electric trains. And yeah, these things will all have an individual effect, hopefully, on reducing emissions. But then if there's some work left to do, that's going to be the job of the carbon market and genuine market innovation to deliver the rest. Okay, what about, I couldn't resist the elephant in the room. That's the Republican elephant in the room there. I thought this looked better than an actual picture of an elephant. Okay, so it's easy to just, there's a sort of rosy view from Brussels, isn't there? I look out and there's stars in the sky and everything is right with the world. I love it every time I go there. Of course, there is the rest of the world, and the rest of the world doesn't quite see things the way the European Commission does. But it's important to keep things in perspective. So if you look at Chinese emissions, China is now much more significant than the US. It's about twice as much emissions in absolute terms than the US. And of course, China is committed to decarbonization, partly because China is very affected by climate change. It's got a big population and a vulnerable environment. And actually, the range of forecasts around Chinese decarbonization, you can say, roughly, of course, I picked one projection at random, is about 4,000 million tons, from the high estimate of decarbonization to the low estimate by about 2040. For the US, the range, as you would expect, is lower, because it's a lower absolute starting amount, so it's about 2,000 million. But this is some nice analysis on the lower panel done by some colleagues at MIT, where they show actually, the range might be even lower than that, because the difference between a deep decarbonization policy where the US does successfully implement a carbon tax, because they're US economists, so they would say that, comprehensive carbon price, and the likely fate of decarbonization policy in the US, because the Inflation Reduction Act and other climate-related policies which have been implemented are unlikely to be fully repealed. TBC, of course. Maybe the range is only 1,000 million tons, between deeper decarbonization and what might happen. And of course, that is to illustrate that, increasingly the US is a side player in global decarbonization. And so what happens for the next 4 years or longer in the US, maybe isn't what the UK or the EU or China should be focused on. We should be focused on global decarbonization, which is bigger than just the US. Okay, well, that's a pretty positive view. And this is one of my favorite diagrams. This is, okay, here's some projections about the future. So geopolitical future, okay. On the left-hand side, we have the world we would like to live in. Okay, the world we would like to live in is a world where we gradually transition away from, I don't know why it's red, from fossil fuels towards the green economy. And gradually by 2100, we have decarbonized the global energy system. Okay, and we either did it because we had a big Green Deal, so we all agreed that we needed to decarbonize as an objective, or we did it because Elon Musk goes back to having some good ideas, and actually technology saves us. Actually low carbon technologies turn out to be really cheap, and they just win as technologies, and it doesn't really matter whether we had a deal on it. It's going to happen anyway as a result of market forces. Of course, that's what might happen. Okay. Of course, on the right-hand side is what probably will happen, which is some combination of some countries continue to decarbonize, like Europe, China, parts of the US, and the rest continues to use fossil fuels. And maybe there is a fossil fuel world where there's slightly less fossil fuels than a more fossil fuel world. But by 2100, fossil fuels are still the dominant fuel in the global economy. And of course, that is the world we're much more likely to be living in, unless something happens and technology saves us, or politics saves us and we get the global UN style climate deal that we actually need. Okay, here's my challenge to scientists, of course. This is of course the way scientists want to be viewed. They want to be viewed as completely benign, friendly people, which of course a lot of them are. And of course we get lots of people telling us to listen to the science on climate change. Of course that's too easy. The science on climate change we've known for decades. What the problem is implementing the social science on climate change is how do you get people to agree to something which is clearly in their interest at the global level, even at the national level, but actually is a massive coordination problem. That's really the interesting thing. Okay, and Fabio was kind enough to mention my interest in Christian ethics, and I do think this is a moral and ethical problem requiring some sort of miracle in public policy. Okay, if we start from here, it would truly be a miracle if we solved climate change and implemented. The miracle is not in what to do. I think I've said that. Actually, we know what sort of things work. The question is, how do you get people to agree to them? And the answer is, of course, that can happen. I know this is my favorite example of how important do you think economists are and economic analysis is. Well, for those of you who know the story, in the first book of the Bible, a full quarter of it is taken up by an economic story of how a poor guy from Israel actually saved the entire Egyptian world by coming up with a cunning economic plan. And by the way, the economic plan lasted 14 years. There were 7 good years where they kept the harvest built. He predicted the famine was going to happen from year 7, and what they should do was build up the stocks of grain in order to meet the famine that happened from the 7 years from the end of year 7. So that's a 14-year economic plan. And of course he did it but in response to a miraculous dream which he had in prison. So that's the sort of thing that needs to happen with climate change, that somehow we need a miraculous spiritual divine intervention in order to get the change of heart that's actually required to implement sensible climate policy. And here's my conclusions. The Brussels effect is real and significant. I think the EU ETS is an immense success of the European Union, and it's only becoming more successful over time. Of course, it does need allies. It needs to add more countries and to demonstrate how it's a model of the global solution on climate change. So coupling to more systems is, of course, very important for the EU ETS to demonstrate. It does need to innovate. One of the things I keep saying to my friends in Brussels is, don't fall behind. What some of the things that are happening in California and British Columbia demonstrate that the EU ETS, needs to cover more sectors with a single scheme, and there are some lessons there. It needs to continue to innovate, but I don't think we should be under any doubt that implementing the theoretical plan for decarbonisation, which the large-scale experiment of the EU ETS demonstrates could work, that would be a miracle at the global level. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we have some time for questions. I'm going to have to ask the kind assistance of Emma and Mercé, please. So if you want to ask a question, just please raise your hand, and I will try to follow the order that I see. Please, here. Then let's try to listen to questions. Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor Pollitt. I'm convinced by your argument, and I buy it. I'm not going to discuss it. But I would like to ask you whether you can extend the implications of the CBAM on the ETS to other areas of policy, and think about competition policy. Okay? The way I see it, I haven't read Anu Bradford's book, but I take it that this Brussels effect is like an example to follow. But from your presentation, I take that the CBAM has been the key element in convincing other countries to follow on their carbon pricing or mechanism. So without the threat of taxing or setting higher prices, tariffs, if they don't implement an ETS, the question would the Brussels effect work? And can we learn something from that, say, to competition policy? It's not only that we need to convince the rest of the world that we are right in applying like strict competition policy, we need to find a mechanism where we enforce it, and they, in a sense, I don't know what, but they pay or they suffer or they implement it in the way that we think, honestly, they should be carried out. Otherwise, they will not follow with the example. I don't know if it's a bit convoluted, but...
May I just ask for his reference, if you could say your name and your affiliation?
I'm Javier Asensio. I'm from the Applied Economics Department at Autónoma at the next university. That's where Angerith got his PhD.
Thank you.
It's a really good question. Okay. So it's a really good question. I think you're absolutely okay. Two things. I think, first of all, I think the reason why the Brussels effect has worked in other areas is precisely because it does have teeth. Okay, so you know, my friends in the Centre for Regulation in Europe, a lot of them do work on digital markets. And actually, of course, now what they say is the reason why there is a Brussels effect is because big tech companies have to operate in Europe. And what actually happens is for things like GDPR, of course, because you've got to implement it in Europe, you may as well have a similar policy across the whole world, because that's easier then to operate your company. And of course, that's exactly how the California effect worked in the US. You know, because you had to build your car to meet emission standards in California, you may as well just build a car which meets emission standards in California and sell it across the whole of the US. So that is how the Brussels effect, the California effect, are meant to work. What you're right in pointing out is that until now, the EU ETS hasn't worked like that. It hasn't had that, well, because I comply in Europe, I need to comply globally. Partly because it is this differentiated cost, where I'm just paying the tax in Europe and I don't have to pay it anywhere else in the world, so why would I? And of course, because my emissions may be directed towards, you know, these are just my factories in Europe rather than my factories in the rest of the world. So what the CBAM has done is given this same teeth that the digital markets and competition policy already had. You know, that and so actually they already were doing this and having this, you know, because you had to comply in Europe, you may as well comply globally.
Thank you. There's another question over there.
Thank you. Roberto Cantoni from IQS here. Actually was not aware of the main details of the CBAM, but it looks like something that I'm definitely more interested in knowing more. My question would be, how do we avoid that? Okay, the EU implement CBAM. Other countries that also trade with, let's say, global south countries, they don't, so they can take advantage of the fact that the regulations is much stricter in the EU sense to trade with global southern countries, and so in the end, it would be a competitive advantage for those countries that the kind of industrialized countries that don't implement the CBAM? Thanks.
Okay, I think that gets to the messiness that we can live with. I think that if our major trading partners implement CBAM for trade between themselves, then in a sense we can tolerate lower carbon prices and lower carbon standards in the rest of the world. I mean, you know, of course it's not quite as simple as it looks, but you know, last time I looked at that, it's something like 30, you know, the 31 largest countries in the world, if they cover about 80% of emissions. So, you know, so there are many small countries that, look, we don't care. You know, they're de minimis. If they have zero carbon price, it really doesn't make that much difference. There are some bigger countries which do matter, like Russia, Iran, or Saudi Arabia, who are potentially quite significant. But of course, it's not altogether clear that some of them can't be brought into the CBAM club. The beauty of CBAM is that in the first order, it gives you a choice. Either you can pay the CBAM tax, or you can just collect the money yourself with your own carbon market. You know, and you know, even it will still be true that for most developing countries, even with carbon pricing, they're going to be cheaper sources of the commodity than producing it within the EU. You know, so but of course, what you will eliminate is the pure carbon price-based competition. But yeah, I mean, it is an interesting point, and certainly the countries that are, you know, the most exercised about CBAM are some of the African countries like South Africa. But on the other hand, you know, they could just implement a carbon pricing scheme themselves and try and clean up their own act for their own benefit. I mean, some of these countries have got, you know, you think of a country like Iran, they've got terrible local environments through overburning of fossil fuels, and they would really benefit from beginning to get a grip on those things.
Okay, thank you. There are the two questions here. There's first here, she raised her hand. Professor Marinescu raised. Yeah,
Hi,
please.
I'm Maria Cristina Marinescu. I'm from IQS, from here. I'm computer science. I'm not going to ask you anything about the economy. I have mainly two questions. They're probably kind of silly, but I'll just go ahead. One of the first slides showed the sources of carbonization, right? Have you measured, have you quantified how more or less what percentage of each of, like, what comes from public, like for companies, what comes from private use, what comes from, because, you know, I recycle, I help.
Okay, yeah.
Well, and this is connected to the miracle thing. So
Yeah.
the miracle, is it about convincing the government, convincing or forcing the companies, or convincing the private people? And the second question, I'll just, has to do with, are there, I don't know, but it seems to me that maybe looking at decarbonization in isolation, I mean, it's definitely useful, but maybe there are connections with other things like, you know, biodiversity, whatever. Maybe we're only focusing on, you know, people and not on animals. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just, thank you.
Those are very good questions, by the way. Okay. I think in answer to does individual behavior matter? You know, I think it can help, okay, but I think it's not significant. You know, and the reason why it's not significant is because, you know, the whole point is we can't know what the impact is. I mean, I've got people who work in the development community who are good friends of mine, and they would say things like, you know, there's tons of money for clean water in Africa, because, you know, every water company wants to sell you a bottle of water where you're helping, you know, clean water in Africa. And so there's tons of money for that, and lots of other things are neglected, you know, like basic healthcare or, you know, things, you know, or economic opportunities for people rather than just clean water. So there's loads of clean water investment, and that I think is the problem with voluntary action, that actually there's no guarantee in a general equilibrium that actually your individual actions will have much impact. The only thing that's guaranteed to have some impact is consume less. Okay, if you live your life as a monk or a nun, yes, you are you're using less of the world's resources, and that definitely helps the environment. Anything else, choices of what you consume, that's not at all clear. Okay, so of course that doesn't mean it's got no value, because the value might be in making you more likely to vote for a party that does implement a serious policy. So and in terms of modelling, what modelling usually assumes is there'll be a baseline of emissions reduction or demand reduction, and that's baked in all the changes in behaviour. In fact, the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, which publishes the 5-year carbon budgets for the UK, has begun to, there's a gap in what the policy is going to do, and it's just begun to say, oh, well, we need more people to become vegetarians. They've actually baked in some of these things which are really difficult to get people to do. So the answer is those things aren't what the modelling should depend on, and it doesn't depend on that. Your other point about the biodiversity is a really good one. Am I saying that the only environmental policy is decarbonisation? No. Okay, we were having a talk about that. One of the issues about pricing one part of the environment is actually it may show up that you now haven't priced these other parts of the environment, and we need to actually start putting better pricing, better valuations on things like biodiversity, which I'm sure Partha Pascoe was discussing. But that's not a reason for not pursuing carbon markets and pricing of carbon. It's a reason for actually, and here's a sort of scientific point. One should think about there being technological progress in social science, and technological progress in social science is gradually over time we understand how the political system works and how policies work, and actually over time we will implement a much more sophisticated set of policies which are more interconnected with each other, which involve more sophisticated instrumentation. Why do we assume that that process which happens in science shouldn't also be happening in social science and regulation? And that, in a sense, that's partly what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for technological progress in pricing CO2. That's not to say there shouldn't be technological progress in how do we price the natural environment.
Okay, so we have to go to the final set of questions. I have seen one there. Anyone else? You as well. So we have one question there. And Mercedes, I don't know, there's one here as well. Yeah, and a third over there. So we finish with these 3 questions. Yeah, so please.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. My question relates more to the energy poverty that also, as a statistic, keeps rising, especially in the European Union, and it's a real problem. So there are people that cannot heat properly their home, do not have access to what they need in their households in terms of electricity. And are there any considerations with their policies that you were mentioning of how we can deal with this problem that it's keep rising as well in the European Union, or how it can be coupled, or how they can go hand by hand? Anything?
Yes, is the answer. Of course, energy poverty is really important, and it's important to say, isn't it, that economists are very clear about trying to distinguish between efficiency and equity, and that the first approach of an economist is always to say, look, let's separate those two. So if you're worried about the income or the consumption level of an individual household, I can give them more money, and I don't give them more energy. I give them more money. I don't give them cheaper energy. I give them more money. You know, and actually that's part of, you know, part of the, you know, we could have a discussion about it. You know, part of the dignity of being, of helping poor people is you want to give them choices and money, not tell them they should consume all these good things, you know. So I think that we can imagine, again, part of the technological progress in social policy is, and I've discussed this with, you know, people in at 10 Downing Street, you know, you can have benefit payments which vary with energy prices. You know, we can have weekly variations in benefit payments to reflect changing energy and carbon prices. You know, why are we assuming that we couldn't completely de-risk certain individuals from energy prices, so they never had to worry about energy prices? So again, you know, this is sort of there are solutions to this, aren't there? And you know, I think part of what the European Union is up to is actually recognizing we shouldn't be giving free allowances to heavy industry, where that heavy industry is often producing goods for, you know, a heavy car that's consumed by a rich person. So that is actually a middle class subsidy there. What we should do is collect the CO2 revenue from them and then target that money directly back on poor households who are in energy poverty. You know, so, you know, we need to be more creative at targeting subsidy. We need to be more, you know, if you tell me the problem is poor people worrying about their energy bill, I can solve that. You know, I can vary their benefit payments in line exactly with what's happening to energy prices. And of course, some countries actually do already do that.
Okay, very good. Over there, please.
Hi, Professor. I am Emiliana from Argentina, and my question is related to Latin America. How do you see the future of this implementation in Latin America, since there are agricultural countries that are carbon takers? So how agriculture can intervene in this model?
How agriculture can help?
Yeah.
Well, lots of, you know, of course, the thing I would say about South America is, of course, a lot of variation there. You know, I've been to Chile and Argentina, and, you know, Chile is very sophisticated. Argentina has been sophisticated in the past, you know, and they've had very sophisticated energy markets. So, of course, having energy markets which integrate low carbon solutions, which is already happening in large parts of South America, and carbon pricing, I mean, this is not a big stretch for many South American countries. And of course, many South American countries might benefit from some of the transfer payments that will happen as a result of carbon pricing, or some of the, you know, if we end up paying the Brazilians to not tear down the forest because it is producing these carbon and ecosystem services, you know, that's a potential source of future income. So I think, you know, all parts of the world can benefit from this. I completely agree with you that actually this global redistribution, which has to happen in a global climate policy, is a problem. And I think part of the solution is getting you know, actually it's the countries in the middle that are the problem, isn't it? Because you don't want everybody to say it's only the richest countries that have to do all of the work, because that's actually not possible. You know, as countries become richer, they need to do more of the work. So China, of course, be a classic example of that. You know, China likes to say it's a developing country, but actually it's an upper middle income country now. So you know, as countries get richer, we will expect them to do more. But if they are poor, we will expect them to do less, and they might receive subsidies via a global carbon pricing system. What I didn't say is, one of the problems of having a tax-based system is you would have to transfer tax revenue that you'd collected in a rich country to a poor country, and that's not going to happen. Whereas if you allocate carbon permits, and the poor country can sell its excess carbon permits on the global market. That is effectively a transfer, but of course it's a private transfer which is happening between polluters who buy the permits on the global market and the government that was given the permits in the first place. And that, of course, is much more politically acceptable than the global carbon tax system. So some of the things I've been suggesting are more consistent with effective global transfers. And that's in fact what, when Nicola Stern was first proposing this global deal, that's what he had in mind.
Very good. It seems we have, I can see Moni, but if it's, yeah, who wants to ask the last question? I don't know, it was over there. No? If there's anyone, because it's further apart, we cannot see. Do we have any questions over there? No. Oh, so we have one last question here. So please.
Oh,
Yeah,
there was
if you
one
Oh,
on the back.
at the back, I couldn't see anyone.
First row there.
Oh, it was Moni, after
It's
all.
me.
Yeah.
I was
So,
waiting for you.
please, so we can have the two final questions. Moni, can you stand because we cannot see you? Well, at least I. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. So here I am, Moni, PhD
Oh, she's a
student,
PhD here.
from
Yeah.
IQS. And my background is about consumer behavior, so I really want to question you about the last part of your presentation regarding to the moral part of the policy, because I think I really agree with you about this social science aspect about this. In China, we have a old saying, money is not everything, but without money you cannot do anything. So I do really feel the essence of your presentation is around this. Could you expand a little bit? Is this having a relation with the hindering part of this this policy that towards to the global one? Thank you.
Sorry, but money isn't there, but we need money.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
what she
yeah.
means, yeah.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we could have a longer discussion about the Joseph case study, because it is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we were having that discussion about what's the role of individuals. I think one of the things that, for instance, the Bible is very clear about is the moral responsibility of leaders and rich people. That actually any global religion worth its salt has particular things to say about the moral responsibility of leadership. And I think, we're all in this room training to be leaders of the future, and we need to understand that leadership comes with a moral responsibility, because it is recognized that you've got autonomy, you've got money, you can make choices, you can choose to pay more taxes, you can choose to sign up to something that's costly and reduces your, the ability to travel cheaply by plane in a fossil fuel driven aircraft. That we have got moral responsibilities there. And yes, this isn't going to happen as a result of poor people changing their behavior. This is about rich people changing their behavior. Yes.
Thank you. That answers my
Yes.
question.
Yeah. So the final question here, please.
So, good morning. I'm Adam. I'm a first-year PhD student here in IQS, and I'm working on consumer behavior and reducing plastic packaging waste. And I was quite surprised that you spoke about 3D printing, because I had the opportunity to buy one this year, and I truly found this technology amazing. And what I wanted to ask you is that could you think that in the future maybe 3D printing could be a solution to reduce the use of plastic? So in that case, could also help in decarbonizing and change consumer behavior by the fact that it can also change on the actual model of recycling from home, because now we know that PET bottles can be transformed to be used in filaments in 3D printing, and also by the fact that we can now produce from home. So in that case, the consumer is transforming from home and producing from home. I
know there are lots of 3D printing enthusiast. I mean, my point was, my Star Trek point was, yeah, if we could design a 3D printer which was like that, which used very little resources, of course, using very little resources to both produce the printer and in the printing. I think where you know more about this than me, but of course where something like 3D printing becomes really interesting is whether you can move towards devices and pieces of equipment which have got totally replaceable parts. Of course, I mean that's the key thing, isn't it? So the exciting thing is if the phone can be recycled and just basically the software upgraded or a few components taken out of it. Why do we need to have an entirely new phone every 2 years? So there is, my colleagues who work on the circular economy, of course, dream about this sort of economy where all we're doing is maintain, it's only when it breaks that we replace it, and we replace it with a 3D printed spare. Okay. Of course, whether everybody needs a 3D printer, of course, is not clear unless they become ultra cheap. But I think some of these technologies are genuinely exciting, and they do, offer the possibility of using less stuff. In the end, we've got to use less stuff if we want to reduce the stress on the natural environment.
Now, we are getting to then the end of our session today. Today, I don't know whether you are going to agree with me, but it was amazingly comprehensive, authoritative, and deep in some of the things because he went straight to the detail. And the way I could see that is that some of our undergraduates struggled, in terms of their attention span, and some are still struggling, to do that. But that's the level we have to discuss the things, and I want to thank everyone who was able to fiercely persist in the arguments and carry on with the discussion. And of course, it was an amazing privilege to have Professor Pollitt with us today. I learned a lot in this session, things that I was not able to understand for years, and I'm sure that many people have this same understanding here today. So thank you so very much again, for a brilliant talk. Thank you.